Britain had also turned its attention to Africa. Now this is key. Because now they lost America, the biggest plantation. How do we compensate for that? What was Britain's plan? And that's why I'm very, very nervous. I'm very, very worried about this big hoo-ha, this big circus that they're planning next year. Because 200 years ago, whilst they were announcing the abolition of the Slave Trade Act, whilst there was this big circus, they were planning a very, very vicious and sinister act of perpetuating the genocide against us. Listen carefully, brothers and sisters. They turned their attention to Mama Africa for conquest and colonization. That was their program throughout the 1800s. Not abolition. But now to establish colonies in Africa. Systems of colonialism. Another euphemism. Watch out for euphemisms. Because in practice, what colonialism is national slavery. It is enslaving Africans in Africa. Rather than lifting Africans out of Africa and bringing us into the Caribbean and into the Americas, which was a very expensive process, now you enslave the African on the African continent itself, which is a far more lucrative program, a far more lucrative industry, so-called, because Africa, not only because you cut out the so-called, the expensive so-called middle passage, but because Africa is the richest continent on the planet. Are you with me, brothers and sisters? So Britain falls on its feet. Yeah? This was a system of slavery. If we study so-called colonialism in Africa, it was no different to what we suffered in the Caribbean and in America. So when you hear our ignorant brothers and sisters talking about Africans sold us into slavery, yeah, and want apology from Africans as though we are anything else but Africans. We were the brothers and sisters and sons and daughters and mothers and fathers, friends and relatives of the Africans in Africa from whom we were ripped. Mothers and fathers were crying for the loss of their children, their babies. Grandparents were crying for the loss of their sons and their daughters, and their nieces and nephews, predominantly between the ages of 15 and 35. For almost 400 years, millions and millions of young people, the most agile and virile of the population, were just ripped out, sucked out of the continent. You have to bear with me this afternoon, brothers and sisters. We have to feel this. I don't want you to just hear me. I don't want you to just feel me. I want you to feel what our ancestors have been through at the hands of these devils, these evil, wicked devils. And this is what they're dancing around now, brothers and sisters. Yeah? Understand that it was slavery. But they couldn't use the word slavery in Africa if they were abolishing slavery in the Caribbean. If they were abolishing the slave trade, they can't say they're going to enslave us in Africa. So they find another word. They were going there to civilize the benighted barbarians. They were going there to end this is what they claimed as well. They were going there to end the slave trade. So they were on the African coast fighting Africans. This is what they claim. And other Europeans to end the slave trade. You want to end the so-called slave trade, you go on the European coast. Why you go to Africa to end the slave? You go to Europe and stop them from leaving Europe. You don't go to Africa along the coast of Africa to stop the slave trade. Stop it from the source. As soon as them leave out, boom, blow them away. No. But they were preserving property. These so-called ships, these so-called Africans, they rescued from ships. They were putting them on plantations to serve British interests. Are you with me, brothers and sisters? Are you with me? Colonialism is national slavery. Is slavery transformed from a private enterprise to a public industry. So rather than the private individual owning the slave, so-called, it's nationalization. It's the government who owns the whole nation. So the whole nation, barring not one, becomes the property of the British government, the British nation. The British nation now rules over the African nation and must subdue the African nation to a level below a beast. Are you with me, brothers and sisters? Yeah? I want us to understand that these so-called Quakers, these so-called friends, amongst other things, they were simply shrewd business people. They had no sympathy towards us as African people, no feeling of humanism towards us as Africans. They were simple, cold-blooded, plain and simple, shrewd business operators with huge investments in the Industrial Revolution, which required cheap labor from the declining slavery plantations. That was their interest, to redirect labor to their factories because they had huge investments. Tendai Mari, we talked about the Department of Culture's book. It is clear that this book is designed to exploit 500 years of miseducation of African people. But let's look, brothers and sisters, at Britain's true abolitionist credentials. Let us look at the 1800s and what they were doing throughout the 1800s. And I just wanted to touch on one or two things. 1800 to 1803, abolitionist Britain, well, we know that we've dealt with that, fought against the Haitian Revolution. 1802 to 1807, abolitionist Britain was encroaching on African hinterlands, or the inner territories of Africa, particularly in the south and the west, conquering territories in a sea of blood as Africans resisted against superior weapons, guns and bombs and cannons. This included a 100-year war, with the Ashanti people. And they claim that they were fighting the Ashantis for 100 years to end slavery. That's a pathetic pretext that they use for fighting the Ashanti to end slavery, because the Ashantis were involved and wanted the system of slavery to continue. 1807 to 1838, major anti-slavery revolts in the Caribbean were brutally crushed by abolitionist Britain by hanging, raping, torturing, severing limbs, burning people alive, burning Africans alive in the presence of the communities of African people, burying Africans alive. Thank you, Brother Kojo. Yeah? African freedom fighters as an example for the rest of us who may even dare to contemplate liberation. 1816, Barbados. There was an uprising in Barbados which Britain crushed, led by Bossa. 1823, a massive uprising which is still commemorated in Guyana, led by a group of church leaders in Guyana, African church leaders. 1831, Jamaica led by uprising in Jamaica, led by Sam Sharp. Yeah. 1831 also in Antigua, led by Class. Several, I want to look also, brothers and sisters, at the so-called move from the Slave Trade Act, the Slave Trade Abolition Act, to the Slave Abolition Act, Slavery Abolition Act. More lies and deception. 1833, August the 1st, acts passed in Parliament to take effect on the 1st of August 1834, the Act of Abolition. But after a period of forced apprenticeship, this period was to last until 1838. So we have to be we have to serve an apprenticeship. That means stay in slavery. Yeah, even though slavery end, we must stay in slavery for another 4 or 5 years. What was this about? We must understand this as well. Enslavers, and this is further evidence of deception, enslavers were compensated by the British government for loss of property to the tune of £20 million. No compensation to us, the victims. The period of forced apprenticeship was a labor tax that Africans were forced to pay to compensate the British government for compensating the enslavers. So we paid that compensation. In America, it was more straightforward. The enslaved African had to work and buy his way out of slavery and her way out of slavery. But with the British, as usual, it was even more deceitful. Yeah? You hear that, brothers and sisters? Yeah? Then they went into colonialism in the Caribbean after the 1838 abolition. So we understand what colonization means. Yeah? In addition to that, imported indentured labor from China and India were brought in to undermine the African demand for a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. So in order to maintain labor, which they were prepared to pay for, rather than paying Africans, they brought indentured laborers to do the work so that African labor would be undermined, so that Africans will settle for any kind of abuse in order to survive. And it's key for us to understand that under the system of colonialism, which was no different, please understand this, no different to the system of slavery, national enslavement as opposed to individual enslavement. That's what we're talking about. Yeah? And under this system, Britain and its people, its subjects, its white subjects, white enslavers, or shall we say former enslavers, continued to exercise the power of life and death over the African. There were laws in place, and those laws remained in place, that an European could not be tried for murdering an African. A European could not be tried for murdering an African. We hadn't even touched on the atrocities that we suffered in the system of slavery. Yeah? Because we could have a separate message just dealing with the psychopathic and fiendish, barbaric and savage deeds that were meted out to our ancestors for 400 years on these plantations. Everything was done to destroy any trace of human dignity that might be left in the African. You know what kept us together? It's our spirituality. It's our culture. It's our communal value system. It was the capacity of the African woman when her baby was ripped away from her breast at the moment of birth. The capacity of that African woman to take another woman's baby to her breast and nurse that baby as though it was her own. And that helped to bring us through slavery, brothers and sisters. The capacity to love another woman's child as though it was your own. Baba John Henry Clark says our humanity has been the reason for our downfall. But by a strange paradox, our humanity has been the thing to sustain us. Our humanity, grounded in our spirituality. Understand that more Africans were slaughtered under Queen Victoria, 1837 to 1901, than any other monarch before her. I'm saying the slaughtering of African lives, particularly on the African continent, proliferated as the century went on. Are you with me, brothers and sisters? The evidence is there. Post-slavery atrocities. Let's just touch on the Caribbean. We've gone through a list from the Caribbean, but one more event in the Caribbean which was post so-called slavery, but under colonial slavery. 1865, the Morant Bay Rebellion, in Jamaica, led by Paul Bogle against the vicious colonial system. Over 1,000 Africans were massacred and tortured. Now, if you look in the government's booklet, that was the year they claim that Britain had freed 150,000 Africans from slavery. 1879, the Anglo-Zulu Wars, mass slaughter of our people in southern Africa. 1884 to 85, help me. 1884-85, Berlin Conference, the scramble for Africa, it's known as, where the infamous Berlin Conference with Britain, France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Portugal, all sat down with a map of Africa and carved up Africa, shared it up among themselves for colonial conquest and colonial savagery. 1888 to 1898, Angola Shona stroke Ndebele Wars in where we call Zimbabwe. Invasion of Zimbabwe, the great city of Zimbabwe, with such a tremendous cultural and spiritual legacy.
Right.
And we had the Shona people and Ndebele people fighting to save our land, to preserve African dignity. 1890s to the 1900s. Anglo Ashanti War under the leadership of Yasantewa. Yeah. And we could hail King Lobengula, the Ndebele king, and Queen Mama Mbuyenehanda from the Zimbabwe kingdom. 1897, the invasion of Benin. This is abolitionist Britain now. Not abolishing. The only thing they were abolishing was African liberty, African lives, African kingdom, African civilization. That's what they were abolishing. African empires. That's what they were abolishing. African spirituality. That's what they were abolishing. African babies were being abolished, but not the viciousness. There was no abolition, brothers and sisters. That's a lie. I said that's a lie. A damn blasted lie. And anyone who peddled that lie is up. Is up. But why are you going to sleep? Is that what? A damn blasted liar. Invasion of Benin, the kingdom of Oyo, from which one of the nations was the Yoruba nation. Plunder, stealing of artifacts. 1860s to 1870s. Missionaries, officials making inroads into Buganda. That culminated in wars in the latter part of the century. 1881-82, Britain invades Kemet or Egypt. 1887, British encroachment into Kenya, igniting wars with the Kikuyu people and the Maasai people, the Kikuyu nation and the Maasai nation. And so they went on and on, conquering the African continent. Britain had the lion's share, Britain and France had the lion's share of the African continent. Since then, Britain has actively frustrated and sabotaged our every effort as a people to liberate ourselves and control our own destiny.